Hello, my name is David. I am one of the co-organizers of this summit. I also work for the Wiyot tribe coordinating the Dishkama Community Land Trust. Welcome. We are excited you're here. I am especially eager to be observer / participant on this particular panel on public banking. I have the great privilege of working with these colleagues and friends through the California Public Banking Alliance. I'll save the substance because I don't want to steal any of their thunder whatsoever for the presentation that's coming up. I will say this as a way of framing. You may have noticed that this is titled Decolonizing Economics, the third annual post-capitalism conference. That's because this is the third post-capitalism conference. And the first two conferences, we did have the Wiyot tribe participating and offering an opening and welcome, because then Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly Humboldt, is on Wiyot ancestral territory. We were honored that the Wiyot tribe participated at the level that they did at the first two. But this year, because of the deepening relationship between Cooperation Humboldt and the organizers of the event and the Wiyot tribe, at the suggestion of Tribal Administrator Michelle Vassell, I went before the Wiyot Tribal Council, the government, to invite them to request that they consider co-anchoring this entire event. Wiyot Tribal Chair Ted Hernandez made the motion, and I am so humbled and honored to tell you that unanimously, Wiyot Tribal Government, through their Tribal Council, voted to co-anchor this event. And through the course of working together, thinking through it, frankly, we came to realize, and by we, I mean the organizers, the tribe, the various departments putting this on, Cooperation Humboldt, that we should rethink it, that post-capitalism really wasn't even enough to capture what we were really trying to do. So we literally renamed this event Decolonizing Economics. That's new territory for us. We're thinking through what that means, and we invite you to be thought partners on us to imagine what decolonizing social, political, and economic institutions might actually look like. With that, I am going to pass this on to my friends and colleagues at the East Bay Public Banking Alliance, Debbie, George, and Eli. Y'all take it away.
Thanks so much, David. We thought we would start with a slide presentation, and then each of the three of us is going to speak, and then we will open it up to conversation and questions. Public banking is a really dense and complicated subject, and we're also hoping you will all have things to help us think more deeply about decolonizing. But I wanted to start by standing up because of where my camera is and showing you my t-shirt. This is a PM Press t-shirt. It's a quote from Ursula Le Guin, who's one of my very favorite writers, was one of my very favorite writers, and whom I was privileged to know a little bit personally. It says, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings." And so that's where we're going to start.
What a coincidence, Debbie. I have this magnet right next to me.
All right. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and show you, sort of the basics of what we're thinking about and how we think about it. Can everybody see that? Okay. So what is a public bank? A public bank is a financial institution owned by public entities. This is such as a city, county, or region, which is true. There are also public banks owned by tribes. There are also other ways that it could work. So a public bank leverages its money to make low-cost loans and provide credit, liquidity, which just means money, and financial services to local financial institutions. It can distribute federal funds quickly, equitably, and ethically, and it reinvests its profits back into the community. Public banks when they're run right, ensure that our dollars work for the public good by giving governments a place to divest public money from projects that don't align with our priorities or community values. The obvious case here is divestment from fossil fuels. The elders at Standing Rock sent everyone home saying, get your money out of the oil and gas industry. People can do that. Governments right now can't. And public banks are one of the ways that can change. Public banks can invest in a sustainable local economy that meets and adjusts to specific community needs. And it can increase public revenue without raising taxes, which we know we all want. So the Bank of North Dakota is the only real major public bank in the United States of America. It's 102 years old. It was formed by socialists who were angry because the grain from North Dakota farmers was going to Minnesota, and most of the profits were going to Minnesota as well. And they built a grain elevator and a bank in 1919. They're both still around today. So North Dakota has more money in community banks and credit unions than any other state. And the other way to think of that number is it means it has fewer deposits in Wall Street than any other state. It recovered from the 2008 recession really easily because the Bank of North Dakota did not invest in subprime loans. So there really wasn't much for North Dakota to recover from, except what it picked up from the rest of the country. In these past 2 years, it has distributed more paycheck protection loans per worker than any other state in the United States, and done it more quickly. It refinances all student loans for residents of North Dakota and students going to school in North Dakota at very low rates. And it makes a ton of money. And that's the money that it and other public banks can return to the communities that they make the money from. So Public Bank East Bay will show you a little bit of where we are in our process as we go through the slides. But we have 5 core values. They are equity, social responsibility, fiscal responsibility, because what good is a bank that goes under, accountability, and democracy. Our high-level goals are to support equitable economic development in the East Bay, but there's also, David will be happy to tell you, there's conversation about Humboldt joining, conversation about Santa Rosa joining. We're not limited to the East Bay. We want to manage and invest municipal funds efficiently and cost effectively. We want to divest public funds from Wall Street, and we want to use public funds to invest in public goals. So here's our model. We start out being owned and capitalized by the County of Alameda and 3 cities, 2 of which are in Alameda County and 1 of which is in Contra Costa County. And we're open to other jurisdictions joining before we open as founding members. We will take only municipal deposits. We're not a retail bank. You can't open an account in the Public Bank of the East Bay, and neither can I. But we can take the money from cities, counties, and then agencies like the water district or a transit district. We lend in partnership with local financial institutions such as credit unions and community banks, and also community development financial institutions, also known as CDFIs. And that helps those banks who know their customers and know their community to expand their loan programs. We have a mission-driven loan policy based on those core values you saw above, which can also be talked about as racial equity, environmental regeneration, and democratic lending processes. Regulated by state and federal agencies. All banks in California are regulated by a state agency, and all banks in the country, almost all banks in the country, are regulated by FDIC, and we are required by the California state law about public banking to have FDIC insurance. And we would be governed by an independent board of directors whom we're recruiting now, with a mix of community representatives, city and county officials whose money is in the bank, and finance and banking experts. Because you can't start out by doing everything, because it's so easy to talk about a public bank as we're going to solve all problems. We have just published a viability study that focuses on 4 things to do at the beginning. And then as the bank grows, we hope to do a great deal more. But our first 4 projects are investing in affordable housing, and very particularly in the short-term financing that affordable housing developers need to get off the ground. There's a lot of money out there for affordable housing, but it's hard to get those beginning loans that let you put together your proposal and figure out what land you want and start looking at what the building would look like. Those are the things that when we did research, we found out affordable housing developers had the most trouble with. We could also help these developers navigate the government bureaucracy. And then we can lend to things like land trusts and accessory dwelling unit, ADU kinds of things that conventional banks tend to look at and go, I don't know what that is, I'm not going to lend to them. So then that's one thing. The second thing is small businesses. For small businesses, we want to partner with CDFIs, helping offer lines of credit and loan participation programs. We want to build out a secondary market for microloans. We want to act as a public face and referral agency for lenders who share our values. And also, it's really the same thing as affordable housing. Workers' co-ops tend to be turned away by banks because banks don't know what they are. We don't have to do that. We understand them walking in. In green energy and green products, which is such a huge area, we want to start by financing building electrification, particularly electrification of existing buildings. And that means solar panels, it means solar batteries, it means getting rid of natural gas stoves and heaters. And if you do that with existing buildings, you can pair it with the affordable housing work and make affordable green homes for people who are currently experiencing homelessness or on the verge of experiencing homelessness. And then the final piece of our initial plan would be to buy municipal bonds and start to underwrite bonds from the cities and counties that participate in the bank. And that does 2 things. One is it saves tax money because our interest rates could be lower than what they're paying now. And the other is it gives the bank a way to start making money from the day it opens its doors. When you make loans, it takes time for them to come back. But when you do this bond underwriting, it happens right away. So that's how we're thinking about starting out. And so we have published a viability study. We'll put a link in the chat. George will put a link in the chat for me right now because I can trust him to do that.
You got it.
And that describes how if we start with $40 million, sounds like a ridiculous amount of money, but in government terms, it's not. If we start with $40 million from the founding members, we can be lending $250 million within 10 years without getting any more money in the door, because that's how banking works. And we can talk about that in the question period if you want. We can support eligible borrowers with flexible loans, and that would be, again, small business people, particularly BIPOC small business people, affordable housing developers, contractors who want to green existing buildings. We would be using less than 1% of the cash and investments of the founding governments, so we wouldn't be a big risk, and we would be profitable by year 3 and returning competitive returns on investments, all of which is essential for a bank to be a bank. One of the things we're hoping to talk about a lot more today is selecting the founding bank board. It turns out, I didn't know this till I started working on public banking, it turns out that every single director of every bank in the state of California has to be rigorously vetted and approved by the state agency that charters banks. And so we want a bank board that is in line with our values and also capable of going through this vetting process. So we're working with as many mission-aligned community groups as we can. When we finished our viability study, we sent it out to over 100 groups with our list of current candidates, requesting their feedback and calling for new recommendations. And then we're using that feedback in the decision-making process, selecting candidates and alternates. We're looking for expertise in the following areas. You can read them as well as I can. Labor and unions, and labor and unions is really the only one that isn't directly represented in our 4 initial programs. We're hoping that we're demanding that they all have alignment with our mission and vision, professional experience, and lived experience. Everybody has lived experience, but we're looking for lived experience that relates to making a transparent, accountable public bank. This is what our bank board candidate pool looks like right now. Just a really, I think, very satisfying visual. And this is our tentative timeline, which is optimistic, but not crazy. And it has the bank opening just a little more than a year from now. And so that's our story. That's basically what we're doing and what we're trying to do. And I'm going to put this question slide aside for now, and then each of the 3 of us is going to talk for a few minutes to give you some of our own personal perspective on why we do this work and why we think it matters. And for that, we're going to start with Eli.
Hey everyone, grateful to be here today. I saw some really good questions in the post as Debbie was talking, and I kind of want to focus on that and make sure those are clarified before I go on and talk about what I think is really interesting about public bank. So for one, difference between a public bank and a local credit union. As I understand it, a public bank is municipally owned. And as Debbie said, it's not a consumer bank where you and I are going to get checking accounts, but it's where our municipalities store their money. And instead of, for example, being at Wells Fargo or something, they have a local physical brick and mortar bank where they keep their money and reinvest in local community. And whether that's in a city or a region, it's for the municipality. Does anybody else want to jump in? Did I miss anything there? Georgia, Debbie?
I think the most important thing there, Eli, is that credit unions can't handle public funds. They aren't big enough and they don't have the right regulatory powers. So while my money is in a credit union, I imagine many of the people in the room have money in a credit union. This county of Humboldt could not put its money in a credit union.
Great. The next question about reinvesting back into the local economy. That's a really big one, and I hope we can all talk about that towards the end, actually, and kind of unpack that together. And then I saw one more that I thought we could quickly address from a consumer perspective. Okay, public bank versus typical bank. Yeah, again, it's not a consumer bank. So I hope that's helpful as we move forward. So getting to the introduction, my name is Eli. I like any and all pronouns. I've lived all over the West Coast and lived in the Bay Area for about 20 years now. I recently got my graduate degree in transformative leadership and the emphasis in social change. And I've come through that studies to understand decolonization as a process that begins at home and begins locally and is in very much touch with a visioning of getting beyond colonial mentality and or committing to anti-colonial struggles. I first came across a zine called Accomplices Not Allies that really aligned with me. And I'm just going to toss in some quotes as I'm talking here that kind of helps ground where I'm coming from. And so as I talk about how I got to public bank, these kinds of things are on my mind. And so I actually learned about public banking last year, as David was talking earlier at the Post-Capitalism Conference. David Cobb and Trinity Tran blew my mind. And I was like, wow, what's this public bank thing? This sounds great. And did some research and found out as I was living in Oakland that right there in my backyard was the public bank East Bay, who'd been doing quite a bit of work for many years, as Debbie and George will probably get into. So I'm newer to the group, and I'm kind of in the hopeful idealist realm. And like I said, I got there through connecting with Cooperation Humboldt and studies in cooperatives in general. So what's really exciting to me about public banks is the idea about divestment and circulating money, our municipal funds, our local taxes, all these sorts of things in communities. And like I said, I live in the Bay Area for the past 20 years, and I see a lot of work being done in organizations and coalitions that are often seen as risky to folks, to big banks, corporate banks, or to more elite interests. I'm really interested in how the public bank can possibly fund things like affordable housing, green energies, land trusts, for example, and getting back to decolonization, that is a recognition of Indigenous presence, not only people of land, but of land too, and how we can shift finances and economy towards an investment in healing and moving forward together. Another thing that excites me about public banking is the idea of investment in cooperative living and workspaces. Right now, that's definitely kind of risky, and I've worked with different activist organizers and had a hard time when it comes down to how are we going to get funded. And this is also true for the Public Bank East Bay. It is in some ways theoretical, but coming into action. And the big question is, how are we going to get funded? I see a lot of care in the world and a lot of people wanting to progress forward and make transformations that focus equity and social responsibility. Solidarity economy is very much parallel to the visions that I see in Public Bank East Bay. And how are we going to get funded for these things? And I think it's exciting to think that, again, for example, in the East Bay, you have quite a large progressive movement that cares a lot about Indigenous presence and resilience. It cares a lot about BIPOC folks. It cares a lot about super exploited and marginalized folks. And it's exciting to me to create an institution that is a prefigurative stepping stone towards forms of solidarity economy and mutuality that I hear so many people envisioning. And again, it's hard, and every week we get together and do our organizing, and it's dirty work, but eventually, hopefully, we can recenter what really matters and hopefully transition towards a better world that it encompasses so much. I want to toss in one more a little quote here. I kind of breezed past a couple of them. More of a dialogue person and less of a monologue person, but I think that these sorts of things are possible, and I guess I'll pass it on to Debbie and look forward to speaking with everyone more a little bit later, but hopefully that helps clarify. Thank you.
Thanks, Eli. I think that was a terrific context, and we really want these conversations from the three of us to be personal. So first of all, I wanted to thank David and Nicola and all the organizers behind the scenes for putting this amazing summit together. The topics are so exciting, and just the number of people and number of people involved, and the passion is, I don't know, regenerative, maybe is the word I'm looking for. There are two things I always say when I talk about myself in public banking. And one is that before I got into working hard on public banking, I got into economic justice work. And I did that very consciously because I think it is one of the cleaner ways for white people to do racial justice work. And I want to be working on racial justice in a way that doesn't foreground myself. So that's one thing. And then the other thing for me was that in 2016, when Trump was elected, I knew that if I was going to stay sane, I had to be working on building something. I couldn't just be working on resistance, as important as resistance is. I had to be looking for something that would last and would be there when all this craziness was over. So those are the two sort of pillars that I come to this with. And then I have been schooled in always thinking, wait, why am I talking? So I am going to keep talking, but hopefully not for too long, because really it's about hearing voices. I was looking at that quote that Eli just put in the chat from David Zamalin, Alex Zamalin, about the needs of the oppressed rather than the universalism professed by the powerful. I'm going to think about that for a while. And then the next thing I would say about myself in this movement, decolonization is so crucial. And yet what I am, and I know this about myself, is I'm an incrementalist. I'm always aware of the conflict between making things right and making things better. And it's really clear that public banking is an incremental move towards taking down capitalism. It's an extremely capitalist project. It's a bank. There's nothing more capitalist than a bank made of marble or not made of marble, for those of you who have old folk song roots. I was brought up by parents who would now be called progressive and were then called liberal, because that's how the words change. And one of the things I was always taught was them that has gets. And I am committed to a world in which them that has get less, and them that don't have get more. So, okay, fine. There are still a million things you can do with your time and energy with all of that background. And what is it for me about public banking? I think in some ways, our tax dollars are our most important dollars, because they're the ones that, at least right now, we have no choice about how big they are, who you elect and what they do. We have no choice about how much money is in our taxes. We have some ability to put pressure on how they're spent. But as long as they are banked in banks that are working against us, there is nothing we can do to stop feeding the fossil fuel machine, the war machine, the private prisons, all the things we hate. Every single time you pay sales tax on your smoothie, you're putting money into the things that those of us here at this summit hate and despise and want to see go away. And so what can we do about doing something useful with that money? How can we get it to represent or try to represent what we want as a community, what we care about and who we support? And I'm going to take a second here to respond to that question in the chat about Walmart. I think whoever asked that's one of the essential tensions of public banking. We go on and on about the Bank of North Dakota, and they're an amazing institution, but they also bankrolled the attacks on Standing Rock, and you can't afford to forget that either. So this is why we work so hard on governance and so hard on getting the right people in the door. and so hard on making this an institution whose values are real and built into its DNA and uh, will last, because it could go that way. We just are trying to build an institution that won't go that way. And so what I think about public banks is that they can not only divert our tax dollars and help our communities and take money out of the hands of Wall Street, they're also an incremental step towards decolonizing how we think about money, how we think about taxes, what we expect, what we're looking for, what we believe our money should do. They're a touchstone for remembering what our money is for, why we have banks at all at this stage in ending capitalism, why we engaged in this project of democracy in the first place, so we can have that argument about Wall Street out there in the sunlight. Excuse me, I said about Wall Street, and what I meant was about Walmart. So we can have that argument about Walmart in the sunlight, where people can think about, are Walmart jobs what we really want for our community? Or is there something better? Are there land trusts and worker co-ops that would really make a difference? And have that conversation without the behemoth that is Walmart running the show. And can we keep our tax dollars not only out of fossil fuels and private prisons and whatever, but also out of making rich people richer, right? Because that's the other thing private banks do, is they feed their shareholders, and most of their shareholders are rich people because that's who has stock. So when I think about public banking, and we're going to go in just a moment to George, who's going to be a little more specific, but when I think about public banking in the context of this summit, I think about democratizing the economy so we can decolonize the economy. I think about this as a step along the way, and a transformative one. And that's what I have to say to you today.
Thank you, Debbie. That was really beautiful. I also want to first start off by thanking the Wiyot Tribe, Cooperation Humboldt, Cal Poly Humboldt for allowing us the space and time to discuss this idea that's near and dear to our hearts. I want to thank Nicola and David for emceeing our session as well. And just give a quick introduction on myself. My name is George Syrop. I've been a board member with Friends of the Public Bank East Bay for the last 2 years. I was born and raised and currently reside in Hayward, which is a town about 30 minutes south of Oakland on Ohlone land. And currently I'm also a candidate for Hayward City Council, with public banking as one of the core values that I'm putting forward as part of my campaign. So I kind of wanted to start there and talk about why public banking is so critical on the local level. Some of the things I'm going to touch on have already been mentioned by Eli and Debbie, but I'm hoping to kind of contextualize them from my perspective. Earlier, Eli brought up the solidarity economy, things like community land trusts, worker cooperatives, participatory budgeting, and of course, public banking to me is the fourth pillar of that solidarity economy picture. And the question always comes up, how are we going to fund these projects? Traditional banks shy away from things like worker cooperatives and community land trusts. And so oftentimes they might find themselves going to maybe a credit union or a community bank. However, because of either the unfamiliarity or the risk of a project, that interest rate that they would be able to offer a land trust project, for example, or a new development might be incredibly high. And so to kind of put into perspective where a public bank comes in a nuts and bolts fashion is that a public bank would look at that project like a land trust and say, this is aligned with our vision for our community. And so we will help undertake some of the capital cost to bring down the interest rate. So in other words, we'll help cover half the cost of that development, and you can bring down the interest to 3%. And now you have a project that breaks ground. And without that public bank being part of the equation, you wouldn't have a new development in the works. You would have less housing in your community. You would have less community ownership. So I just want to kind of paint a picture of the very material way that a public bank helps out the community, whether that's a worker cooperative or just affordable housing. In the context of Hayward, where I'm living currently, our city council is having an incredibly difficult time attracting affordable housing developers. Everybody's rushing to make market rate housing, but the second you tack on some affordable housing requirements, they just decide to build somewhere else. So where are we going to get the capital to partner with affordable housing developers? Enter a public bank. So I'm hoping that I'm starting to paint a picture of all the ways in which just having this financial institution exist in our community enables the beginning of so many projects that we desperately need in order to resolve many of the crises that our cities are facing today. So I wanted to touch a little bit on governance and structure. We went over it during the slides. We have a few areas of interest that we believe are critical to the public bank providing value to our communities. Like I mentioned before, there's housing. Of course, there are topics about green energy and the environment. We really want to ensure that labor is involved in this process as well. Small business and worker cooperatives, financial experts, and agency representatives. And so as we went out and recruited board members, we're doing so with an eye on having people that speak to these different areas of expertise. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the founding agencies of Berkeley, Richmond, and Oakland and Alameda County that will have to approve this business plan and approve the different candidates that we've recruited to make sure that both the regulators and the agencies are on board with the leadership that we've been working hard to bring in. Going forward, however, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. There is an organization called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative in the Oakland area, and they kind of are like a hybrid affordable housing land trust model. And they have a very interesting governance structure where several of their board directors are actually appointed by community organizations. And so in Public Bank East Bay, we've been working on a model of bringing in the next round of board directors. And this is still very much a work in progress. It's something we wanted to open up as part of the conversation for later about how we can maybe work with different affordable housing groups, different green energy groups, the labor councils, small business associations, to facilitate some type of appointment process between all of them to help make sure that we have interests and expertise and authentic representatives from the community being put forward to help guide and steer the Public Bank East Bay. I think the last thing that I want to touch on is a lot of what Debbie was saying towards the end on decolonization is that I really think that Public Bank East Bay needs to go further if we're going to talk about decolonization. At first, I was a little unsure about even presenting here because, like Debbie said, this is an incrementalist and somewhat reformist project. So it challenges us to think, how do we take it to the next level? I'd actually push back a little bit on Debbie's definition of a Public Bank East Bay being a capitalist project, because I don't think all the bank's dollars are going to come from exploited labor, maybe some of them. But we do exist in a capitalist dominated economy. And Public Bank East Bay, as long as it's within the United States, is still a colonial project. It's reformist rather than revolutionary. And I think any institution that builds on the political project known as the United States is going to end up being that way. However, I think that Public Bank East Bay has a kind of secondary purpose. At least this is also an educational movement as much as it's an economic movement. Because like Debbie was saying, it's important for us to rethink how we think about our tax dollars, the kind of physical manifestation of our labor stored in weird pieces of paper for no reason. Well, not for no reason, but it's kind of a weird religion that we all subscribe to. But I think it's really important for everyone to understand that alternatives to the privatized financial system exist. And whether the United States exists or not, people should still demand that any financial system be run by and accountable to the public. And I believe that's a critical part of the work that we're doing is we're cultivating that demand through education. So there's a more concrete project that we're doing at Public Bank East Bay, right in our region, but there's the larger project of making sure that everybody says, we want that, wherever it is, whatever it is, whatever country it is, we want a public bank. And it's one of the reasons why almost a third of all financial assets are stored in public banks. The US is just a little bit late to the party, no surprise. So I just kind of wanted to end on a few notes about how we could start to move towards real decolonization. Something that we still need to work into our business plan, and hopefully I would like to work into the business plan. I don't want to speak too much on behalf of the group here because these are kind of my thoughts on decolonization. Is I'm wondering if there are ways for us to have a percentage of profits go towards rematriation and reparation funds so that we have actual material benefits going to disenfranchised communities and having that built into the business model itself. Of course, our project has to jump through a lot of regulatory hoops across many levels of government. And so, I worry, will that sanitize or dilute this public bank's capacity for positive social and economic change? Or can we maintain that vision and get it through with the appropriate amount of community support? So as we move on to question and answer and discussion, I kind of want to open the floor to anyone that might be able to speak on models of community accountability or progressive reparation or funding models that they've seen put into practice. Like any institution, it's the people within it that will make or break it. But I truly believe a public bank provides us with the frameworks necessary to create a financial institution that's more responsive and accountable to the community it serves. And it's not just a matter of saying it, it's a matter of putting it into practice. Thank you.
So we asked David and Nicola at this point to open things up so participants can raise their hands and we can have a conversation. But there's a good question in the chat from Gloria Thomas that maybe I can take on while people think about what kind of comments they want to ask in real time. And Gloria's talking about a region where the city government favors capitalists and corporate interests and what the options are there. And I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I might turn to George of the Silver Tongue in a minute, but I think you probably have to work on making that shift before you work on building a public bank. I mean, as I said, in North Dakota, which has done many fine. Well, actually, that's another way to think about it. North Dakota is as red as you get, and as business and corporate oriented as you get, and still the public bank did a fantastically better job with subprime loans, a fantastically better job with the Paycheck Protection Act, a fantastically better job with student loans. So maybe the way to think about it is to think about the things that everybody wants, right? The public bank can do the things that really are bipartisan.
Yeah, I would agree with your answer, Debbie, and especially the first part of it of starting with the council. In our strategy, we've been very deliberate about building relationships with fairly progressive city councils and making sure that we had the appropriate support there, because at the end of the day, at least in California, based on how the California Public Banking Act is written, it's these city councils that are going to be submitting the business plan to the regulators. And so without having the level of support you need there, it's going to be very difficult to actually be able to get the public bank's charter. So I think what's really difficult about a lot of political projects and why we're seeing a shift back towards local politics or a trend back towards local politics is I think there's a realization that we're kind of starting at square one with how much we need to rebuild new institutions and new structures of power. And while that might feel disillusioning at first, I think it's also very clarifying about what comes next. And so in the case of the town that you mentioned, or the city that you mentioned, I would say, let's start with building that progressive movement and getting progressive folks into power so that they can start leveraging those seats of power for ideas like public banking and more.
I'm going to jump in. I'm going to take Debbie and George up. Eli, before you joined, Debbie and George, because I serve on the California Public Banking Alliance executive committee with Debbie and George, and they said, you know, if you want to add something as a color commentator. So I'm going to actually take that opportunity because, and first I want to say thank you to all three of you as presenters for a really fantastic job of public banking and to really situate a public banking presentation within a decolonizing economics summit context, and to invite us to help push you and collectively to think through what would a decolonizing process look like in the public banking context. So thank you. And George, I loved how you fearlessly talked about, look, it's as long as it's within the settler colonial project known as the United States of America, it is colonial, you know, by definition. And then what, right? Like, because I as somebody who thinks about this, I'm going to put on my co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy hat and tell you, for me, and George, yes, it's not revolutionary because revolution process is completely restructuring everything. And Debbie, you're right. This is by nature, I mean, it's a profound reform. Don't make no mistake about it. I think that public banking may be the most profound non-reformist reform you can have. It's still a reform, but it's non-reformist. What do I mean by that? Remember this, that reforms by nature say, all right, we're going to take the existing structure, the existing rules, and we're going to make improvements in people's lives, right? And I, like you, I'm sure everybody on this call fights for reforms all the time. You know, a hike in the minimum wage to get closer to a true living wage is a reform. Have we just, if we win that fight, when we win that fight, have we made people's lives better? You damn right we have. And that reform is absolutely worth fighting for. And we could go down the list. So fighting for reforms, like I never, ever poo-poo the idea of fighting reforms. But what about fighting for non-reformist reforms? What do I mean by that? I mean reforms that, yes, make people's lives material better, that can be done right now, but undermine the logics of capitalism itself, undermine the dictates of capital, undermine the assumptions of white supremacy and settler colonialism. I'm going to drop into the chat now the U.S. Solidarity Economies Network's candidate questionnaire on 6 concepts that we call non-reformist reforms: public banking, participatory budgeting, worker-owned cooperatives, community land trusts, locally owned energy production and distribution models, and 6th, universal basic income. Every one of those are happening right now. Every one of those are reforms that will make people's lives better. Every one of those are, in fact, reforms, but taken together, if there was any community doing all of those and doing it in a public participatory way using encuentros or people's movement assemblies or however you want to say that, right? You would actually see the kind of zapatismo in practice, literally restructuring society from the bottom up. Some people call that socialism from below. My point is, y'all, I think public banking is a non-reformist reform. It is a way to begin to democratize finance and money itself, and taken together, if we're doing it intelligently and sincerely, it is in fact helping us to restructure society. So that's me sort of chiming in, and I didn't see anybody raising their hand, so I want to encourage folks, if you do want to join the conversation, Nicola and I can take you off mute because George, Eli, and Debbie have asked us to do that. So we stand by ready to do that.
So Nicola did raise her own hand.
I
And also
did
there's
raise my hand.
and also there's a question in the chat from Lori Herrera, and we can take those in either order.
Well, I'm happy to go in whatever order y'all like. So
Nicola, let's hear from you.
okay. So one thing that just came up for me, and I also I didn't mean to replace everybody there in the spotlight doing the tech stuff and doing the question asking, but one thing that I was curious about was connecting a lot of what you were talking about, George, thinking a little bit more about those next steps. I was really excited about that, how we think about putting into practice the decolonizing practices that we are really advocating for here in the summit. But also bringing in and doing that nod to the post-capitalism conference last year from Eli, thinking about the presentation with Trinity Tran and David Cobb and others to really talk about this as an option. One of the things that was so inspiring about that last year was this kind of thinking about, the crisis that we were facing as we were entering into COVID, and how specifically people of color who are business owners were directly targeted by the downturn of our economy, closures from COVID and not being able to recover financially. And I'm curious if you're seeing more of an incentive or a little bit more of a kind of conversation or like an openness to thinking about public banking happening now that we're in this space of sort of restructuring and reimagining and rethinking opportunities, or if the conversation is shifting in your sphere of how you're engaging with public banking.
Go ahead, Debbie. I'll jump in after. Or Eli,
George knows I'll always answer. I think yes. I think that BIPOC small business owners, not that they didn't already know that they were at the bottom of the ladder, but they got a real hard school of hard knocks taste of just how low at the bottom of the ladder they were, and just how outside of North Dakota the PPP loans so many of them went to cronies and football teams and exactly the people that, in my view, they're not meant for. So one of our supporting organizations is the Bay Area Association of Black-owned Businesses, and their executive director is one of our board candidates. And we conducted a survey with them as part of our viability study with the members of that organization. And I think that, yes, there's more interest in public banking. And it's also, to pick up George's educational project, it's more familiar. You more often get somebody going, oh, I heard a little bit about that, than you get somebody going, what? When you talk about what you do.
Yeah. And I think what I'd want to add on to what Debbie said, and just in the context of COVID specifically, is that it's important to think of a public bank as a form of disaster preparedness as well. When you look at COVID and you look at North Dakota, because they had a public bank, and because a public bank enables several other community financial institutions like credit unions or community banks to thrive around it, meaning that there's more financial institutions per capita, that means you have an easier time distributing funds when crap hits the fan. And so when we're looking at what happened in every region around the country, except for North Dakota, they weren't as prepared as they could have been for that disaster. Because if you look at the trend across the last 50 years, we're seeing we're seeing less and less financial institutions per capita, and more big banks kind of dominating the market, which means that it's harder and harder for folks to get access to financial resources and financial education. To answer your question directly, I do think that folks are more open to the idea now, because they're realizing we can't keep running the status quo play over and over and over again, especially as the recessions are coming faster and faster and faster. Yeah.
Maybe we can go to Lori Herrera's question in the chat. I would encourage people to scroll up and look at it. But the key point is the last point, which is public banking as safe, or I would say only as safe as those who run it. And I think the answer to that is that's half true. What we're trying to do is a hybrid where we build a lot of the safety and the values into the DNA and the charter, and force the directors to be accountable to the values, and to pick the right people to run it, and pick the right people to pick their own successors, and to work on really radical community driven models of the board picking its successors, and try to hit it from both sides. So that, yes, it's only as safe as the people who run it, but you can put some controls and constraints on the people who run it, which will help.
Absolutely. And then there's the additional element of having the agencies having appointed representatives on that board as well. So beyond just the community board members, there are the agency board members, like representatives from the cities of Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland, Alameda County. And what's beneficial about that is at least there's an increased level of transparency and increased level of accountability that doesn't currently exist. I mean, the default right now is, okay, private shareholders of this Wall Street bank, like, we trust you with our money. And if there's a financial recession, all right, well, I guess we're going to have to bail you out against our will. Like, that's what currently exists. That's the standard that we're up against. And so we're doing our best to try to put as much accountability and transparency into this process. Of course, no system is ever going to be perfect, but it's significantly more accountable than what currently exists. And we're trying to improve it as we keep going through this process.
Other questions? Anna asked where people who are passionate about these things bank. And I would, if you're asking for yourself, Anna, I would say join a local credit union. Check it out a little bit and make sure its investments are good, are ones you support. But in general, credit unions are smaller, more personal, and better to deal with. I see a hand from Justin. Justin, I think you can unmute yourself and talk.
Good afternoon. So I have family in the California correctional system, and as part of their setup, they actually do have a credit union included. So it's interesting to kind of see, hybrid models from not just public banking, but public sectors for specific needs of different kinds of employment communities. That was one thing I wanted to bring up. But to the larger picture, I'm curious what the thoughts are on things such as banning layoffs during public emergencies, and also raising interest rates on those who companies that use tiered employment compensation models, because that's a societal unrest structural concern.
Yeah, I could jump in for a few parts of that. I think an important distinction to make before I attempt to answer is that Debbie, Eli, and I represent the Friends of the Public Bank East Bay, which is the nonprofit trying to create the bank entity itself. And so when it comes to deciding a lot of those policies, such as no layoffs during emergencies or higher interest rates with tiered compensation models, these would be questions about loan policies that board that we're trying to recruit would have to wrestle with, along with the staff that would be running the bank. And so, it sounds like there's a progressive way of tackling those questions, but ultimately that would be a question that board and the staff would have to wrestle with and come to a decision on. Debbie or Eli, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
I think it's also important to say that a public bank is just that, it's a bank. It's not a city government. That's one of its values. Is, we get a certain amount of pushback that says, why would I want my city government to run a bank? And I'm in complete agreement with that. I don't want my city government to run a bank, even though it's a pretty progressive government. All in all, I want bankers with my values to run a bank. So Justin, when you talk about things like banning layoffs, that's not a bank's purview. That's a city council's purview, or a mayor's purview, or a county purview, or a national purview. It's just not us, right? And it's this business of, if you try to solve everything, you don't solve anything. But I think the question about tiered compensation is an interesting one. And the idea of tiered interest rates for people who have tiered compensation, punitive interest rates, is really fascinating. And as George says, it's the kind of thing that the bank board would have to reckon with. I like to think our bank board wouldn't be loaning to those people in the first place, because they aren't the people the public bank is for. More questions, thoughts? And the person in the chat who's concerned about cannabis, I'm really sorry to hear that you're having trouble. At this point, we don't see public banking as a cannabis solution, in part because as Brett, who's one of our compadres in the California Banking Alliance, said, we have to have FDIC insurance by law, but I certainly hope that gets solved.
I want to jump in really quick and talk about, again, like how decolonization is really a process at the local level. And I'm looking back at the statement from Lori and thinking about, at no point does capitalism exist without forms of mutual aid, communism, socialism. They're all there all the time. It couldn't exist without it. And thinking about places where cities are maybe like your representatives are geared more towards profit-centered, those other groups are existing as well, and how to create coalitions amongst those groups to maybe help bring forward something like a public bank, or something that has a greater interest in the local people and the planet and the ways environment and resources are distributed. And so definitely I wouldn't give up, because those people are there, and just how you organize yourselves, and thinking again about like decolonization being a process. It's an ongoing thing. So just wanted to throw that back at Ori, thinking about you there.
I want to recommend a book, which anybody who knows me knows I can't stop talking about this book. David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything is a book that makes Eli's point, but makes it for the last 15 or 20,000 years of human history. that all of these things have always been going on, and there's a kind of a controlling narrative that says everything always gets more hierarchical and more dominating and worse. And this book spends 500 pages taking that apart. And I see both David Cobb and Eli are with me on this. So I'll put it in the chat. More questions?
Got one from Micah. How much flexibility, sorry, a new chat's popped up. How much flexibility would a public bank have around the 7 C's of credit, specifically around the common lack of financial history for marginalized entrepreneurs?
I think a lot. I think we're starting to talk, you're starting to see people talk about social credit and relationship credit. And I think the public bank in cooperation with CDFIs can really look at those things and not limit itself to, I don't know the 7 C's of credit, I'll be honest, but not limit itself to a person's specific financial history, but understand the whole context in which a person is applying for a loan. I think that's really one of the things we have to offer.
We have another question. As we are in a capitalist system, cities feel the need to compete with each other. This comes into play when they want to build big development projects to attract outside investors. So with a public bank, how would a metropolitan area compare with a small city? Would the smaller city have a chance to grow with a public bank? And also, would a large metropolitan area be able to regrow / not hoard wealth? I think the first thing that comes to mind when I see that question is that the idea of attracting outside investors is an older model of economic development. I think we saw that most clearly with the whole Amazon HQ2 debacle, where mayors were tripping over themselves to basically sell out their public and their public's tax dollars to attract an employer that at any point in time could pick up and leave if they got a better deal elsewhere. And so I think with public banking comes an intentional reinvestment and redevelopment of your own local economy. The idea is you are building up and cultivating the systems necessary so that you're not constantly relying on outside capital to come in, but you're developing that capital internally. And so I think cities, both big and small, can actually rely on this model. I think a larger city would have more profits to work with, but even a smaller city could thrive. And what comes to mind here is something like the Cleveland model, where they looked at the local anchor institutions in Cleveland after it was decimated by the recession. Anchor institutions are organizations or institutions that are less likely to pick up and leave, like a hospital or a university. And the city actually worked to develop a laundry worker cooperative, a laundromat worker cooperative, to service the nearby hospitals, creating jobs, creating education opportunities, and creating wealth within their own community. So, that was a very intentional approach, rather than saying, okay, what if we just lowered our taxes further and attracted a Walmart and tried to employ folks? Instead, they did what I think is the more difficult, but also the correct path, which is how do we invest in our own community, develop sustainable jobs in our area? So that's an example of how a small city, I know Cleveland isn't quite small, but in terms of like economic prowess, was able to rebuild itself. And I think the same could apply to larger cities as well. So I would really recommend looking up the Cleveland model or the Preston model, which is a modified version of the Cleveland model. There's really beautiful diagrams about the circular local economy that it creates. And so public banking is definitely a part of that picture.
I also want to add a couple of things. First of all, one of the things that fascinates me about the Amazon debacle is really what they were doing was a fishing expedition. They got extremely deep demographics on every city that applied. And they have those, and they got those demographics free for nothing, and they have them now and they use them. So it behooves city governments to be really careful about what you're giving away to get into these bidding processes. And a robust public bank could give a city government some cushion to make them less fearful about feeling they had to jump into those shark tanks. But the other thing I wanted to say is we have a lovely example in the East Bay. We're very fortunate to have a progressive county treasurer. And he, as the representative of the county, is one of the people on our proposed bank board. And he has said in those meetings to 15 or 30 or 40 people, I know the county has the most money, so I know the county will have to be the biggest investor in the public bank when it opens, right? He said that publicly. It's sort of, I mean, it's very visionary and it's very aspirational, but the more you can put bricks in the wall of turning greed around into solidarity, then that builds itself, right? Once it starts building, it can build itself. The same way David was saying that all the planks in the solidarity economy are all happening now, right? So I think these are real questions and they're real fears, but I think that there are ways to counteract them.
I also want to jump in on this question about cities competing with one another. You're absolutely right, and I appreciated George's sort of point about rethinking quote investment itself. One thing just to lift up, note that is literally the Cleveland model is in fact a non-reformist reform example. It's still operating completely within that system, but make no mistake about it, those people who are working at the Evergreen Cooperative are having a better lived experience as workers, as worker owners, and so forth, right? And I would say, and I say this with humility, but not pride, but I'm very happy to say the California Public Banking Alliance is literally an example. Remember, the state law that we all worked on said there can, at least the pilot project, only 10 local or regional public banks for 857. Now, we're all convinced that we're going to get that extended when people get a taste of how good they are, right? But right now, you're seeing literally cities or activists within those cities are sharing resources together, literally having a community of practice. We're not like trying to build a competitive advantage. We're literally coming together on monthly calls, and I'm hearing people say, this is what I learned. This is what our survey said. Oh, and so sharing of resources, like it's a different mindset. That's point one. Point two, I want to say one thing that I discovered, I got into public banking, not unlike Debbie and maybe others, which was Standing Rock, divest. And then we found out you can't, like, all right, well, where do we send the money, said Seattle and other places. We said credit unions. Credit unions said we won't take the money, right? I was like, what do you mean you won't take the money? Because they can't handle it. Their business model does not allow them to take the huge sums of money, right? So I began to learn deeper about finance itself, because I had this, as an anti-capitalist, I had a scathing critique, but I'm now learning transactional work. And here's something that I discovered. The city of Eureka, hell, the entire county of Humboldt, we don't have enough assets in revenue from our governments, all the way, like you could add up every dollar in the city, the county, governmental dollars, including the districts, fire districts, school districts, et cetera. We don't have enough money to capitalize a public bank. So we're going to need to become a depositor in, we hope, the East Bay public banking, right? So again, public banking is a different thing because there's not a need to return a profit to shareholders, right? So the business, it's still a business, but it's a different business model completely than private banking. So yes to everything George and Debbie said, and remember, it's a different phenomenon. Last thing that I want to say, pop quiz. Do you know how much that $6 billion East Bay Bridge cost? Because I keep hearing the $6 or $7 billion is that East Bay Bridge. What did it really cost? I bet George, Debbie, or Eli know the answer. Maybe somebody else does. Really, $14 billion. $14 billion. You know why? Because when you count up the cost of the privilege of borrowing money to finance it, it literally over doubled the cost. That's just for the privilege of financing it. Public banking, if it's big enough to capitalize, you can virtually have the cost of every single public infrastructure project, boom, like that. So I just really want to underscore this idea. It's not a private bank. I can't become a depositor, or it's not consumer. I can stay in my credit union for that. But a public bank under the 857 law actually is for public projects, for public dollars to invest and reinvest.
So the cities loan the money to themselves, and so therefore that $8 billion of bridge banking costs, that money either never goes out in the first place or it comes back to the cities who loaned it, instead of going into the pockets of the Wall Street shareholders.
So, and I want to point out that Nicola has asked, as somebody who teaches at Cal Poly and splits time between Humboldt and Eugene, I know. So she says, so how does my contribution change the local benefits that we might get in Humboldt if we invested in a public bank elsewhere? So, and that's a good question, and we are grappling with it now. But one thing I know is that I would rather see our public tax dollars be deposited in a public bank in East Bay than I would where they currently are in Wall Street banks, right? But it would be interesting to imagine, well, could we, and would the East Bay Public Bank, as it comes online, because remember, it's all going to be a chartering process, could there be a way to say, well, if you're a municipal depositor that reaches a certain threshold, you get a seat on the board of trustees, and there's a process to allow the democratization process. In other words, so that we're not merely customers of the public bank, we're actually, our governmental unit would actually have governance ability, and that's an open question.
Well, we're certainly thinking about that, and even before that, it seems clear to everybody that I've talked to about this that Humboldt would get, as a depositor or as an early capitalizer or whatever it is, would get returns that were proportionate to their investment, right? So a certain percentage of the loans would come back to Humboldt because Humboldt was a participant, and a certain percentage of the profits, when profits are distributed, would come back to Humboldt because Humboldt was a participant. And then the whole question of governance, all the cities want governance seats, and why wouldn't they? And we want them to have them. That all has to be hammered out, but it has to be hammered out transparently and equitably.
There was a question from someone else. For your approach to green energy, how do you view solar as sustainable? From my understanding, 99% of solar infrastructure is mined with petrol machinery in underserved countries and managed and profited by communist countries.
I can take, I've been looking at that question, so I can take a little bit of a stab of it. I see Gloria's there. It has to be done in tandem with zero waste manufacturing and degrowth. I think that Gloria is really beginning to put her finger on the answer to Jeff's question. And what the public bank values do is they would encourage the zero waste manufacturers and the degrowth advocates, and again, help shift the balance to, how can you make solar? Somebody is looking at how you can make solar panels sustainably.
Yeah.
Right. Somebody is paying attention. It happens not to be me. Maybe it's somebody else in this room.
I can.
Go for it, Mark, and I'll jump in after you.
Thank you. Okay, so the way that we make solar panels today is we take a ton of white sand and we melt it, and we get a 2,000 some odd degrees centigrade, and we get we get about 700 pounds out of that. Eventually we make it into a big crystal, cool it for days, saw it with where we lose a chunk of it from the saw curve, and eventually we get these little thin crystals and skinny slices of crystal, and that's And that's an extremely intense, energy intensive and resource intensive process. And they use acids to purify it and stuff like that. So instead of that, what we're working on is you dig some ceramic oxides out of the ground and you grind them up into a powder, and then you grind up into a finer powder, and you basically put them together and you fire them, and that's your product. You have to do it the right way, otherwise it doesn't turn out right. But if you can do that the right way, you get something that has twice the solar capacity, twice the solar output per square foot of what we're using today with that other process.
Got it. Thank you for that. And I mean, when I'm hearing this, it's validating what Debbie had just said, that newer and more energy efficient solutions are being developed. And my hope would be any solar energy project a public bank would invest in would be using the most energy efficient process going forward. I think I also wanted to agree with what Gloria said about doing this in tandem with dismantling capitalism and colonialism and degrowth. A public bank, right now we're just starting with decarbonizing buildings, trying to remove some of the natural gas infrastructure and electrify it. But in the future, my hope would be a public bank that's robust and powerful enough to help finance public transportation projects, because what we're finding in urban environments is that it's road use and buildings are some of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters. And so, as a public bank grows in scope and in deposits and available capital, what can it do to actually tackle these larger, more capital intensive projects to reduce the overall carbon output that we're creating in our cities? That's something that I'm looking forward to. And we're obviously way before that, but I'm hoping we can grow to that phase.
I think I just really quick also want to throw in there that there's a lot of different approaches to green energy, and that universalizing green energy, we're all going to go to batteries. That's not a decolonial approach. It's about working with what exists locally and working with what exists where you can have exchange that isn't the free trade that I have grown up around, but is actually more about solidarity. And I think you're making an interesting point, Jeff, that there's a lot of different ways to do it, and in some cases, we don't want to be supporting transnational corporations that are exploiting elsewhere, extracting elsewhere, but again, looking and organizing with each other locally. I think I'm going to throw in a really cool article here called Between the Devil and the Green New Deal. And it really talks about what you're getting at and how we make sure to find accountability without going nuclear, being local only, because that doesn't address decolonial efforts either. And so I think you're getting at a really big topic that takes a lot of effort and a lot of communication and accountability. But I appreciate the question for sure.
Nicola asked any things you all need help with. One thing I forgot to mention when I was presenting earlier was that we would love to be connected with any folks in the East Bay area that you may have connections to that are unfamiliar with public banking. We're always trying to build our solidarity network and connect folks with the project. And we're also looking for folks that may be interested in being one of the board candidates as we begin to finalize our first round of first picks and alternates. So I'm going to put our Gmail in the chat. It's just publicbankeastbay@gmail.com. And any introductions would be greatly appreciated. We're always trying to grow our movement out here.
And in the same vein, it would be remiss of us to not say we are raising money. Eli, I think, is the only one of us who mentioned this, that we want to be the economic source for a lot of transformative projects, and we need an economic source for our own. The reason that we are raising our own money is because we feel that it gives us much more leeway in developing our own governance structure and our own values. If we were to get all the money from the county and the cities, all the startup money, we think that would give them more power than we want them to have in what the bank looks like, and particularly to go back to that question about is a public bank only as good as the people who run it? So we are raising money. Our website, I will put our, George, would you put our website in the chat as well as the Gmail?
Yep.
And small dollar donations are great. Access to people with more money is great. And just talking about it. The education project is such an important piece of this. So, and people who, I saw someone who was leaving say this was all very new to them. Come to us with questions. We'll answer your emails. We'll talk to you.
Also, we're on social media if you want to connect with us. We are a part of, we do Public Banking 101s. I don't know if any of you present got to see the California Public Banking Alliance Town Hall, but we'll blast about things like that. There's really cool conversations happening around public banking and forms of decolonial economics and economic transformation happening, just transitions, things like that.
Gloria, that's such a big question for the end of a session. I'm going to ask David and Nicola to put that on the agenda for next year.
It's a good one, though. So I'm going to answer Nicola's question when she said you all, because I'm going to answer as a member of the California Public Banking Alliance statewide network, because we have, I don't know, George, Eli, Debbie, I'm thinking we've got about probably 10, a dozen communities where we've really got folks active, but we have a process for helping onboard and helping other people in other places in California to create local public banking efforts, right? So I dropped the California Public Banking Alliance website into the chat. If you contact us, what we will do is literally say, oh, where are you? Oh, if you were anywhere in East Bay, we're going to get you in touch with the East Bay Public Banking Alliance. If you're in San Francisco, like we know where there are activists actually working on public banking. We also know lots of places in California where there are not actually organizations working on it, right? So I really encourage you, if you contact the California Public Banking Alliance, I know that it's true because I'll be the one to do it. Actually, that's my responsibility, is to help nurture new organizations that come into being. We've got fantastic resources, including human capital, that can actually help you do that. Because I will, and I'll conclude this. I've learned, I'm anti-capitalism about anti-capital. We desperately need capital in order to do the transformational decolonizing work that we need to do. So let's work together.
Absolutely. And one quick disclaimer I want to make just about our presentation in general is we were speaking on behalf of Friends of the Public Bank East Bay, but each of the different chapters in our California Public Banking Alliance are all taking very interesting approaches. We all are following the California Public Banking Act that was passed by Newsom in 2019, but it's so fascinating to see each creative approach each chapter is taking to work with their local municipality or their local region. And what we're finding is, no two strategies are the same because no two cities or two regions are the same. There's a lot more, if you're interested in this movement, to dive into to see how different groups are approaching creating a public bank in their area.
So I'm going to invite Eli, George, and Debbie, in that order, just because that's how I see you on the screen, for any final thoughts before we close out.
I guess one final thought is thinking about that next step that I think it was Gloria that was just asking about, is one thing I got really inspired by from David Cobb and Trinity Tran last year was talking about offers and needs markets, and to add on to that, gift markets. And I agree, we need capital, but also what's behind the capital is all of our relationships. the trust and the bonds that create and organize human energy. You know, that there is something behind that coin. So that's what I'd leave it as to what's next.
I felt so prepared for this presentation until that last question. What is a note I want to leave on? I think my hope is that folks will come away from this feeling a little bit less intimidated by banking in general and by the concept of public banking. And I really want to reiterate what Debbie and David said, which is to reach out. We've found that the folks that get most involved in this movement are the ones that we have conversations with, and we really want to answer your questions and talk to you about this project and help demystify a lot of what banking has made. Okay, I know what I want to say now. Banking has been intentionally kept vague, and it's our right, it's our money, and we deserve to have a say over it. And so I'm just really excited for people to get educated on public banking, to share this knowledge with folks, to get people involved in the movement, because that's how we start taking it back. And that's how we make it ours again. So that's what I'll leave it on. And thank you so much for having me.
And I'm going to come in with a personal note. Eli came to us because of the panel at this summit last year and has been a fabulous addition to our team and our board. And I'm hoping there's someone in this room, particularly someone with connections in the East Bay rather than Humboldt, or someone you know that can come to us and help us expand that way with more people putting in sweat equity to make this happen. And thank you all for great questions and a cute dog.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. This was, as folks are commenting in the chat, this was an incredibly informative and educational panel. And it was also so inspiring to hear about the potential and the developments of public banking. I love that you all were connecting things from our previous years and previous spaces that we've been talking about this, and showing the network building, growing, and advancing through your all's work, but also through these kinds of shared spaces where we are able to engage in conversations like this and learn about new projects and processes and strengthen the work that we're doing. So thank you all so much for this. This has been an incredible day of a first opening day of the summit, day one, and we still have so far to go. But we have so much that we get to participate in as well. We've been learning a lot through all of the panels that have been happening, and we're closing our panels and presentations in the sort of format that they've been today, and we're moving to our first cultural offering for day one, and this is going to be a film screening put on in conjunction with the Native American Studies program at Cal Poly Humboldt and the Food Sovereignty Lab. The films are El Cacao, The Challenge of Fair Trade, and No Place to Grow. These two films will be screened, and then included in this evening's presentation is a discussion with the filmmaker Michelle Aguilar. So that will be happening from 7 to 8:30. That's included in the schedule links that we sent out to y'all. So thank you all so much for participating in day one. Thank you all so much for concluding our formal presentations for today, for the first day of the summit, and we look forward to having more conversations throughout this event together. So thank you all.